So Michael has joined me yet again in our continuing conversation of David Bentley Hart's final essay of the book You Are Gods, entitled The Chiasmus, with the subtitle The Created Natural and the Divine Natural. We got through the first 6 bullet points on our first discussion, so we're moving on, and I'm doing the odds, so I'll start with number 7. Once again, the unthinkable, the impossible, is that the phenomenal eidetic Platonic order of essences that we necessarily inhabit as rational spirit is not the real order of being as such, and not even an epiphenomenal expression, because in itself that reality expresses nothing at all, but rather is only the representing faculty's useful dissemblance of being's utter opacity. Being then would be a pure enigma, an unintelligible occasion of an intelligibility whose coherence lies in its illusoriousness. But then would not that very coherence of the illusion itself be something of a miracle, a kind of fortuitously continuous concomitant of the inexpressive reality, an inexplicably correlated or synchronous negation? At its most debased, this view of things becomes the materialist superstition that all that really exists is some hyperphenomenal or hypophenomenal realm of pure quantifiable extension, force, and mass, while the glorious, glamorous veil of the phenomenal experience is nothing but the product of an illusory consciousness deluded into thinking it's really experiencing what is in fact an illusory world.
Yeah, so there he's kind of making the case for the sort of epistemology that modernity has to ascribe to, and what its
Right.
full range of consequences are. Yeah, I feel like it could be more clear. But it sometimes many times when I was reading this, the one criticism I have, I think it's very compelling and persuasive, but I think the choice of words sometimes can be rather almost purposely opaque, I would say.
Well, I'm not sure that it's purposely opaque. I mean, part of it is just a style choice, and then a part of it is a desire for precision, I would say. Essentially, what he's saying here is that be, viewing the world that we actually experience as merely illusory in the way that the scientific worldview does is a pointless endeavor, because our minds inescapably experience it as real.
Mhm.
So it makes it a pointless hypothesis, because there isn't another world that you can actually inhabit and live in.
Well, I think he makes the point. I guess what I get out of it is more the point that if you do accept that epistemology, then there's no point talking about any sort of rational, reasonable order, at all. It all foundationally collapses,
Right.
if you accept that, and so all your claims about being more or less correct fade into illusion. They don't have any substance any longer to them. So it's even the sort of scientific claims about being quote unquote factual fade away as well.
Well, this kind of like, I mean, it's like I would say that this is, I mean, the perfect example to illustrate this again is Wolfgang Smith's point about the physicist's baby. I mean, the physicist is going to inevitably see their baby as a baby.
Mm-hmm.
which is a qualitative thing in this world that we experience, no matter how illusory that experience is from his point of view as a physicist, he is still in the world where his baby is a baby.
Yeah. And to that point as well, phenomenologically, we're always experiencing these sort of levels, right? Where, and even in our own kind of recollections of our own experience, we can recall, what we thought when we saw the world at level X, and then, after some experience in some, um, in some growth in our own wisdom, we can see that we can now both inhabit that old perspective, but also have something above it that is higher and more transcendent. And so, like, I think that, we're always kind of combining those things. Like, we're always being aware, and in some sense, anytime we talk about, comparing perspectives, right, or we're having an argument of some kind about which way is better, or which of these things has more value. We're always making appeals to that, that higher and lower. And again, if foundationally it's all an illusion, that sort of all of those activities are also completely illusion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly. That's right. I think ready to move on to the next section heading and to number 8.
Yeah.
All right.
This one's a long one. All right. A metaphysical boundary was crossed, albeit invisibly, even inadvertently, with the Trinitarian dogmatic definitions of the.
Okay, so we actually had an interruption in our recording here, so I'm gonna have Michael start over again from the beginning on number 8.
Yep. I don't think I read the subheading either, which is part 3, Trinity in creation as the chiasmus. So part 8. A metaphysical boundary was crossed, albeit invisibly, even inadvertently, with the Trinitarian dogmatic definitions of the 4th century and their sequelae. I don't know if I said that right or not. And thus, a new path for Christian thought was opened, a wholly ontological way of speculation, as opposed to a metaphysics of pure hierarchy within totality, in which an implicit univocity of being reduced God to the supreme, quote unquote, existent, merely prior to and more original than all subsequent independent existence, at the inaccessible apex of the hierarchy of things that are. Once it had become impossible to conceive of the processions of the divine persons as a progressive diminishment of the paternal origin, as an accommodation to lower reality, or to conceive of the created order as located simply at the termination of that continuum, creation came to seem, in one sense, detached from the taxis of the divine. Much more radically, however, it was revealed as being, quote unquote, located nowhere, but within the very life of God as God. Its existence, its constitution, its form, none of these could be seen as merely a remote effect of divine power. All of it had to be seen as a revelation of the divine actuality, as theophany. All of it came to be seen as the immediate action of God as Spirit through the Logos, who is the perfect reflection of the Father. What causes creation to be, to have form, to live, is nothing other than a direct participation in that order of relations by which God is God. And yet, as far as theological consciousness was at first aware, the final resolution of the debate was determined by soteriology. Only by way of the co-equality of the divine hypostases was it possible coherently to maintain that the Spirit, in conforming creatures to the incarnate Son, truly joins them to the eternal Father and thereby truly deifies them. Still, this meant that the Logos, as understood in light of the Nicene settlement, is not a reduced manifestation of God, who in his fullness is simply beyond all manifestation. Rather, the Logos is the eternal reality of God's manifestation of his own essence to himself, and therefore the eternal act whereby God is God. This perfectly co-equal convertibility of God within with his own manifestation of himself to himself is God's own act of self-knowledge and self-love in the mystery of his transcendent life. Thus, his being is an infinite intelligibility. Even his hiddenness, his transcendence, is always already manifestation too. This movement of infinite disclosure is nothing less than his quote unquote essence as God. As Gregory of Nyssa says, apart from his Son, the Father would have no light, truth, wisdom, life, holiness, or power. The eternal mirroring of the Father in the Son is that one original act of knowledge in which each of the persons shares. The only begotten, says Gregory, who dwells in the Father, sees the Father in himself, while the Spirit searches out the depths of God. God himself is an eternal play of the invisible and the visible, the hidden Father made luminously manifest in the infinite icon of his beauty, God speculating upon himself by way of his absolute self-giving in the other. Or as Augustine says, the co-equal Son is an image that perfectly fills the measure of the Father imaged in him. And the beauty of this perfect correspondent eventuates in that fruition: love, joy, love, rejoicing, delight, felicity, and beatitude, that is the Holy Spirit, who in turn fills all creatures with his own bounty. Quote, therefore, those three are seen to be mutually determined and are in themselves infinite. End quote.
So, any, what do you have to say about that?
What's interesting
He seems to be, first of all, he seems to be kind of precluding any kind of monarchical trinity there.
yeah, there's a co-equality throughout. And there isn't, and he says, any sort of sense of there being some aspect of God that's unknown to other parts of the Trinity is absolutely anathema as well. And of course, he makes, in making reference to Nicaea, right? He's saying that this all kind of hinges on I think the word he uses is the soteriology of saying that there has to be this co-equality is necessary for salvation to be effective.
Yeah, he says the final resolution of the debate was determined by soteriology. Only by way of the co-equality of the divine hypostases was it possible to coherently maintain. Yeah, that's right. So he's saying that, like, essentially that for the soteriology to function, that co-equality was necessary. I've always, I've kind of like I've kind of not been an absolutist on the egalitarian versus the monarchical model of the Trinity. I've always tried to keep an open mind on that. What do you think of the case he makes here?
For whatever reason, like a lot of the arguments around that have always, for me, remained so abstract as to not feel pressing and important. But here he kind of, I don't know, the case here, he makes it compelling that by linking it to soteriology, he's also linking it to that more ancient notion of salvation, which is divinization, right? Which is something
Right.
kind of foreign to this sort of concept of that word that I grew up with. And so it's something much more interesting, much more maybe even more difficult to believe. But obviously even more so in the time period when this was being, like, all these sort of theological things in the early church were being worked out. I mean, it was even more difficult for them, I think, to.
Sorry about that. I just accidentally hit my space bar.
I don't know.
Technical difficulties because I accidentally hit my space bar. Okay. So what were you saying? If you want to,
I was just saying, like, I think, well, one of the larger points he's making here is that the Trinity comes about as a concept because of these wrestlings with soteriology and what that meant explicitly to them being divinization, and how that had enormous consequences and was just kind of really. I think today we have a hard time because we use these words so sort of tritely, and they don't have this sort of gravitas that they did back then in terms of things like the divine. So it's I don't know. I think I'm getting away from your main question, which is, what are my thoughts on this? I think the argument he's making here is, in some sense, if it's not the case that there is this equality in the Trinity, then we aren't really divinized.
that's
is what
right. That it's a qualified. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's which means that to me it comes out of it's to me it's more of a development of Christology. I mean I actually don't know why he says soteriology, because to me it seems like it necessarily develops more out of the Christology than the soteriology. I'll have to think about that. I didn't quite take, and he doesn't really elaborate. He just kind of makes the claim without saying why. I mean, I could speculate, but I wouldn't know for sure what the reasons were. But to me, it's more obvious that it rises out of the Christology. Like, well, okay, like Jesus is God, but in what way and in what sense, and how are you to make sense of that? How is he both God and man, and what does that mean?
Yeah, it is. I think it's, and it's hard to think about these things as being substantially different from one another and then still co-equal, right? I think that's hard.
And we'll leave that because that's going to be, I think that's going to be touched on a lot in this essay. So we'll just leave that as
Good.
kind of hinting at maybe it's part of what's coming. But we'll leave that for now, and then we'll just go ahead and move on. And that means it's my turn for number 9. It is from this original circle of glory that the logic of created being unfolds, a specular ontology, according to which creation is constituted as simply another inflection of an infinite light receiving God's effulgence as its primordial gift that completes itself in summoning its own return to existence. Creation is only the answer of light to light, a created participation in the self-donating movement of the Trinity, existing solely as the manifestation, the reflection of the splendor of a God whose own being is manifestation, recognition, and delight. I think that's a pretty short point. I think we can just move on. I don't think there's much to say there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean,
he's basically. Essentially,
why does he make this its own point? Because
I think he's okay. Let's go. Let's go over it again. In its original, because it's short. It is from this original circle of glory that the logic of created being unfolds, a specular ontology, according to which creation is constituted as simply another inflection of an infinite light, receiving God's effulgence as that primordial gift that completes itself in summoning its own return into existence. Creation is only the answer of light to light, a created participation of the self-donating movement of the Trinity, existing solely as the manifestation, the reflection of the splendor of a God whose own being is manifestation, recognition, and delight. So he essentially, he's just pointing out how everything is an icon of God in that in that passage. And That's something that is so intuitively obvious to me that I didn't really have much to say about it. So, but if you do have something to say about it, by all means. I don't want
I
to.
think you're right. I think it's a further expression. The Circle of Glory quote with a footnote is it's reference to a Gregory Nyssa work called Adversus Macedonianus. And it looks like the subheading is something about the Holy Spirit. But yeah, I think you're right. It's a further cementing the fact that creation and
Right.
God can't be separated.
Well, it's
All right.
this whole reflection and mirroring
Mhm.
is the key term and the key concept there.
Okay, so we'll move on. I get a short one
You
in
get a short
return for
one.
my long one. 10, inasmuch as being must be convertible with manifestation or intelligibility, then the God who is also always logos is also eternal being with a capital B, not a being, that is, but transcendent being beyond all finite existence. Here at last is a Christian rationality of God as S subsistence or being in itself, which is to say, an entirely Trinitarian rationality.
So, okay, let's break this down. Being must be convertible with manifestation or intelligibility, because he's earlier already pointed out like the pointlessness of an unintelligible vision of reality.
Or
So,
aspects of God himself that are unintelligible.
correct. That's important. Yes, good point, Michael. Then the God who is always logos is eternal being. Is also eternal being. Because logos is what gives it, and that, I mean, it's through the logos that we have that intelligibility and manifestation.
Mhm.
Which isn't to suggest, but it's not something different from. That's part of the divine unity, right? So it simply, it is transcendent being beyond all finite existence. So the logos isn't like the highest of beings, like
Mhm.
you would have in some, like, say, pre-Nicene models.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. This it's a substrate of existence itself, therefore, which is again why it can't be separated from creation, because creation would not exist.
Right.
Okay.
And so he's saying this is the Christian understanding of esse substans being itself,
Okay. I think we got this one.
which is Trinitarian in its nature. Um, even though he only
Uh,
mentions he only mentions the he doesn't actually say anything about the spirit there, but I think that once you have the I think once you have the Father and the Logos or the Son um as equally eternal being, the that the spirit necessarily follows from that.
right. And
Um,
that's another working out of Nicaea that he makes reference to. And I will say this, that like for me, the ways in which the spirit get described, and even when he earlier back hearkening to the end of 8, it does always feel impersonal, right? The way it's sort of like this sort of fallout that's derivative of the relations of the Father and the Son. So, and I know I don't want to get into this too much now, but I think, there's a few things that deal with this in more specific detail, but specifically how this spirit is co-equal later on at the end of this towards I think it's the
oh
very
yeah,
last bit.
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yep, absolutely. Okay, so moving on to 11, which is this is a longer one. At the same time, a question was implicitly raised and is secretly incubated by Christian tradition, one could occasionally be glimpsed in certain of the more daring speculative schemes of pre-modern Christianity. The thought of Maximus the Confessor, the system of John Scotus Erigena, certain fugitive formulations in Nicholas of Cusa, but that for the most part remained unspoken. If God's eternal being, as God, is his knowledge of his own essence in the infinite mirror of the Logos, and the consummation of this act of knowing is the infinite satisfaction of the Spirit, and if therefore there is no surfeit of the Father over the Son and the Spirit, no yet more hidden transcendence of the Father grasped by himself alone, by way of some kind of superintellection beyond manifestation and recognition. And if God is then an infinite act of intelligibility who knows himself in and through the manifestation of himself to himself, how then can the event of God's eternal self-knowledge be discriminated from God's eternal knowledge of creation in his Logos? Or that knowledge of creation from his eternal being as God? Surely the temporal is, from the perspective of the finite, contingent. From the perspective of the eternal life of God, God's manifestation of himself to himself is never without his manifestation in creation, and so creation is eternally present within the eternal act whereby God is God. Obscurely, perhaps, and first entirely subliminally, but nonetheless inevitably, the possibility is something like the Hegelian deduction is implicit as an inevitable moment in Christian reflection, one to be either ultimately affirmed or ultimately rejected, or ultimately qualified, but not to be avoided. What we understand to be a particular history of revelation depends upon and discloses the reality of a universal history that belongs from everlasting to the shape of the divine life. If indeed the logic of the Nicene settlement was determined principally by the demands of soteriology, it seems difficult to avoid the ultimate conclusion that in the Ordo Salutis and the Ordo Entis are one and the same, and that all exists, and that all that exists has its being as God's knowledge of himself in his Logos. The union of creation with God is both the most ultimate and most original of creaturely truths. Divinization, though it be the consummation of creation in time, is the beginning of creation in eternity, and it can be neither without being the other, and nothing can exist that is not always already in eternity divinized, plunged ecstatically into the fire of the divine life.
That's quite the argument.
And that's also quite the line, especially that last line. And nothing can exist that is not always already in eternity divinized, plunged ecstatically into the fire of the divine life.
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard to argue against that, right? Because it's something deep and eternal about the shape of the divine life. And so like whatever, and you have to, and I'd say this has to be true, because if you postulate some other means of, like, you know, where I don't think the only thing absent this is some sort of process theology, I think, influenced motive of conceiving things where like the end is in doubt, because it's sort of you're giving creation this sort of independence from God, such that it can kind of go its own way and do its own thing and be self-determined, which I don't think makes sense, ontologically speaking. But I think that is the felt sense of modern phenomenology, is that we have been left to ourselves, that we were created, we were kind of given this oomph, we were imparted with some divine spark, and now we're left to our own devices, and whatever happens. And it's sort of up to us to kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and either save ourselves or burn the planet up, with our whether it is idiocy or something like that, is kind of the modern felt sensibility.
But if there's not also some sort of creaturely freedom, then this claim is in fact pantheism, as it's been accused of being.
The point you
So the
mean,
only thing that the only thing that saves it from being pantheism.
the point that you mean, the argument that David's making.
Correct. The only thing that
Yeah.
saves it from being pantheism is that if the existence of the divinized creature already in eternity divinized is actually a free existence. Because otherwise, it doesn't actually exist. Its existence is only a part of the existence of something else, which has independent existence.
Yeah.
But I
And
think but I think that's part of what being divinized means, right? Is being part of being divinized is to possess that kind of ontological freedom that I was just referencing. So it's like, yes, that's why I think I don't know if it's exactly panentheism. Like I know Milbank lately has been saying that neither pantheism nor panentheism is correct. And I think the reason that he's been talking wrong along those lines is that there's a lack of understanding of the mutuality of the creator creature relationship in both pantheism and panentheism.
mhm,
Whereas this kind of idea of like the necessity of that which exists having been in eternity divinized within the eternal within the divine, uh what's the word I'm looking for, let's say within the divine, let's say the divine world. That's the word I wanted to say and I thought it was wrong, but I'm gonna say that anyway. um and if it's wrong, it's wrong, but that's because that's the word I wanted to use. um uh and I totally lost my train of thought.
well, I mean, the initial point you're making about freedom, I think, is really crucial, and I think especially the fact that we have kind of weird notions of what freedom is now. Um, and I don't know that he explicitly. I feel like he alludes to his definition of freedom in somewhere in this essay, but I don't. I feel like that.
Well, it's not, he doesn't have a libertarian definition of freedom. He considers it
Right.
incoherent, right? I think like his definition of freedom would be like the classical definition of freedom, which is the freedom of of a being or a creature to be the kind of being or creature that it is, in the fullest
Yeah.
sense, right? But that has to, here's the thing though, is that it has to still be truly free to be something other than God,
Yes.
right? Or I mean, otherwise this really is just pantheism, right? So it still has to have so even though God is bringing God is drawing it into the divine life, and its source is out of the divine world and out of the divine life. It still has it still has a real existence. It still has an ontological freedom.
Yeah. And I would say again that this freedom, I've made this point in previous conversations, but I think that the freedom is rooted in God's own self-sacrifice and giving himself, such that we have real autonomy. Just like,
Yes.
in the previous conversation talking about Tolstoy and, him being surprised that Anna Karenina decides to kill herself at the end, right? And who was it? Rowan Williams saying, "Oh, if Tolstoy could have decided any any ending. And my disagreement with that is that not exactly. That's not how characters manifest themselves to authors as sort of like things that they can be pulled around. I mean, that obviously we do see, authors that do that with their characters in ways to kind of tell their own stories didactically, but that's not, we all
It's
kind
not what
of
great
can,
authors do, though.
exactly, and we can recognize it. We kind of know. We're like we feel betrayed, and we notice it, especially in stories that are otherwise great in ways that pull us in, and then there's this
Right.
turn where like we can tell like that doesn't seem like what that character would have done.
So what Rowan said is that that Tolstoy, the author, could have arbitrarily decided any path that he wanted for his character Anna Karenina.
And she wouldn't have been able to
But
argue against
Tolstoy
it.
knows, no, this is the kind of person that Anna Karenina is.
Hmm.
And I have established this, and I know this to be the case. Therefore, she must be true to her nature and do what she would do, not what I would have her do,
Hmm.
but what she would do.
And there's it's funny is like in Anna Karenina and having a nature in some sense that's been given to her by her creator. There's certainly limitations, right, that are placed on her, but then there's also this sort of some sort of autonomy that's able to evolve out of that.
Yes.
That's real, such that Tolstoy himself can be surprised by what the character decides to do.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's why I think this is ultimately like saved from the accusation of pantheism, because I think that actual kind of ontological freedom is still implied, even though like Hart would scoff at the idea of libertarian freedom. That ontological freedom, which makes you a real being, it still has to be affirmed.
Right.
And I would say that for it to be pantheism, then there actually is like I would say if pantheism is true, then your existence is really just illusory and inconsequential in the final analysis, because God is the only thing that exists if pantheism is true. So you have just like you have an absolute monism, although that may be what Hart intends, because I know Hart has a tendency to think that monism is the end of the story, and I think he's dead wrong.
Hmm.
And I think that Christian non-duality is a non-duality that still contains duality. And I think I actually think it's a fatal mistake. So anyway, he's much smarter than I am. So, but I just that's why that although to be honest, a lot of where I'm at I got from reading his books. So I'm not sure that he would disagree with me. Although he's not really clear about what he means by monism, because I would not call the Christian monotheism ultimately end of the day. I think it's not I don't think it is a monism.
Hmm.
I think the Trinity is trying to express something that is beyond monism or dualism. So anyway.
Yeah, I feel like it sort of breaks down into how you want to define things, and yeah, so it becomes kind of, some of it becomes semantics, although obviously there's a lot that hinges on those things. Do we want to try and do one more?
Yeah, let's see how long it is. Yeah, let's do it. I think one more and we should be
Okay.
good.
All right, so this is 12. Inasmuch as God is not a finite being in whom possibility exceeds actuality, but is infinitely actual, and is in fact the eternal act of all things actual. In him, there is no meaningful modal distinction between freedom and necessity. He is the supereminent fullness of all that is, and his freedom is the unhindered actuality of being who he is. Therefore, his quote unquote election of himself in the Son, in the Spirit's light, is also the eternal reality of his election of himself and all that is contained in the Logos, including the entirety of creation and history. The drama of creation and salvation is not a distant analogy of the divine life, and the presence of the taxis of the Trinity right within the dynamism of creaturely divinization is not merely a secondary effect of the eternal divine taxis. Neither is it something external to the divine identity, nor is it the exhaustion of the divine emanation in some kenoma outside of the divine life. However inviolable and absolute the analogical interval between God and creation may be, it cannot be an interval merely of accidental and extrinsic relatedness between two separate things. Our being in God and God's being in us are both also and more originally God's being as God. And so nothing can be excluded from that return of all things joyously to their source, and yet really exist, any more than God could be only one part of a larger realm of actuality. Nothing can exist in history that is not always already redeemed and divinized in eternity. All things are created in their last end. And if they were not already fully reconciled to God and in full spiritual and ontological union with him, they would never come into existence. Created spirits exist because they are from everlasting gods with a little g in God with a capital G. And then it says vita infra. I think that means he's going to continue the argument below.
Yeah. Okay. That is a whole lot. Maybe actually that is, let's see. Do you want to try to tackle that now, or do you want to like save
Well,
that?
we could say a little bit about it. I mean, I think
Okay.
it entails logically from what he just said. I mean, this is very carefully built, one fragment on another, but this idea that, again, everything that God makes is built of the stuff of God, so it can't
Right.
it can't in some sense, the point he's making here, if that wasn't true, it would not come to exist, because again, God isn't a being, he is being as such. And again, he's already made the argument earlier that being is itself the quality of intelligibility itself, or in which, and that intelligibility is the sort of necessary attribute for existence itself. So for it to escape that, for it to be somehow outside that and extrinsic to that, and sort of, again, this sort of deistic concept of God, is to say it doesn't exist at all. And I do think, in some sense, I think that's the sort of the felt phenomenology of modernity is, in some sense, that we don't exist really, that we're in a simulation. We're sort of this
Or at least that our existence has no intelligibility to it, which is effectively the same as not existing at all. I think we can say that.
yeah, or there is a sense like that we're derivative from something real, but we're so far removed from it such that we can't really trust our own instincts. We have to kind of do this sort of helter-skelter, like mind tricks on ourselves to try and ascend the
Yeah, but
ladders
that's
of
something real
illusion.
that we're derivative from is actually lower than us. Oddly enough, right? How does that and how does that make sense?
Yeah.
why would we assume that something that is on a lower layer of reality is what's really real? I mean,
That lower layer being what exactly? Sorry, I may have missed your train of thought there.
let's call it the physical layer,
Hmm.
okay? Um, because the layer of reality that we inhabit isn't really the physical layer, right? Because we live in the world of phenomenal objects, right? Which the scientific materialist worldview doesn't see as what's really real.
Hmm.
What's really real are the laws and forces, and smaller components that make up those objects. That's what's really real.
Right.
And that is definitely a lower layer of reality than what we inhabit, right? So what so I guess
But
if
you
we
can,
aren't,
I
so
think you
since
can draw it.
I think so, we refuse to look, so we refuse to look upwards for that to understand. That's where human beings used to look upwards to understand that, to try to answer that question, what's really real,
Mhm.
right? And now we're looking beneath us.
Yeah, you can definitely see how that. I think, yeah, the longer you look down, the more you become stuck in this sort of mode of existence where there is no unifying order to anything. It is all kind of random. And again, like the reason there's this emphasis, right, this focus on the sort of mathematical, the formulas, it's a means of trying again to decode the matrix that we're in and try and find the secret to, so that we can escape, and we again escape the illusion and get back to something that is more real. Now again, I don't think the scientists that are doing this stuff, that they experience reality that way, because there's a certain
No,
life that I think infuses their love and knowledge, and their curiosity in whatever fields of endeavor they're in. But somehow the way that gets distilled and brought into um, our collective consciousness, it feels so flat and empty and meaningless.
right.
And it absolutely starts, in my opinion, theologically, it starts with movements toward placing God first, very far above creation, so far above it where we're just kind of like scum. And then you have the deist conception where God's not even in the scene anymore at all. Like he created us, the mechanical universe, the watchmaker's universe. He kind of wound the thing up and then like goes, go do your thing. I made you perfectly. Go do whatever you want to go do. And then once you live with that sort of mode of existence for a while, then you find, well, if God just wound it up, we can find clues to him here, but like we don't really need him at all. And it seems like atheism comes right from that.
Right.
Um, and now,
And this is expressing something quite the opposite, because it's expressing like the absolute interconnectedness of, essentially it's implying that the existence of God must necessarily, by nature of what God is, imply the existence of creation. And he anticipates objections by saying, that's why he says, uh, he is in his in the super and imminent fullness of all that is, and his freedom is unhindered is the unhindered actuality of being who he is. Therefore, oh, actually, I missed it. Okay, it's the previous sentence. Let's see. Inasmuch as God is not a finite being in whom possibility exceeds actuality, but is infinitely actual, and is in fact the eternal act of all things actual, in him there is no meaningful modal distinction between freedom and necessity. So that so that's there to deal with the objection that you're somehow putting a limit on the freedom of God if you say that God by his nature necessarily creates. Hart's just cutting that off by saying that the nature of God is such that that modal distinction between freedom and necessity does not apply at all.
Yeah, that's something we could probably talk about more in the future too, because I feel like when I was reading that, I was like on like the cusp of almost grasping what's different about freedom for God than for us. And it goes to the heart of our finitude and God's infinity, but it sort of it kind of eludes my grasp.
There's
In
actually
the
a
end.
lot here. There's actually a lot here. I would actually
Okay.
like go ahead and reread. Let's plan on picking up with that one.
Okay.
And we could probably spend a lot more time on that one. I think that's kind of an important
Cool.
point to
Yeah.
me.
If I have any insights, I'll put them in the comments. In the meantime.
I mean, there's a ton there in that little paragraph. There's in a lot of these. So we're going to spend a lot more time on a lot of these points because he's just like,
Yeah, I definitely think it's
he's
worthwhile. He's
yeah.
going right down to the very depths of these conversations and taking them. I think this has been useful.
Mm-hmm. All right. I've enjoyed it. Well, thanks for joining me, Michael, and I'll see you next week for part 3.
Sounds good.